So I guess this begs the question, how did your path lead to Orson Welles, and how did you, as a young man, how did you meet him, and how did you end up being involved as an actor in the 70s for The Other Side of the Wind?
Yeah, it's quite a funny story. It's kind of a Walter Mitty adventure story, for a young guy. Mm-hmm. I was 19, and I was at the University of Wisconsin, September 22nd, 1966. I remember the day so well because it changed my life.
I bet.
I was in my first film class, Professor Richard Byrne, which was Susan Kane. I'd never seen this, and when I went to Wisconsin, I wanted to be a journalist and novelist. I was already a journalist, but I thought I'd write novels. And then I saw Kane, and it changed my life, and I thought, okay, I want to make films and write about films. I was so excited. And I somehow managed to get a print of the film, 16-millimeter print. Back then, it was hard to get your hands on films. And I ran it 60 times in the next 3 or 4 years. And there was also the screenplay was at the State Historical Society in Madison. It was in a collection there.
You do, by the way, share that also with Welles, is that you both come from Wisconsin. But go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that was part of my attraction. I thought, wow, the guy from Wisconsin and the youth of this fellow, the young man that a lot of Truffaut said that about. He said more filmmakers have been inspired by Kane to start their careers than any other film, and part of it is his youth inspired people. When I met Welles, I said I'd like to direct a film by the time I'm 25, like you did. And I mean, he was 25 when it came out, and he kindly said, "You will," but I didn't, But I was making my own little films, and I was writing screenplays and teaching myself how to write scripts. But I was typing the script of Kane by Herman Mankiewicz and Welles because I couldn't afford to Xerox the thing. I was so broke. So for a month, I would lug my typewriter up there and type the exact copy of the script.
You would?
And so that was my Bible, that and the film. And I was running a film society on campus, so I could show the film to myself as often as I wanted. I was seeing all kinds of other films. So I spent 4 years writing this book on Welles while I was running these film societies, and I was washing dishes. I was living very hand-to-mouth thing, but I was excited because I was teaching myself film history and film writing. I had already written a book on baseball when I was in high school, so I kind of knew how to write a book.
On baseball?
And yeah, the baseball book is called High and Inside, an A to Z Guide to the Language of Baseball, which is about slang. Baseball slang was a passion of mine. And it didn't come out until 1980. Put it in the 60s. It took a long time to get published. But so anyway, I was almost done with this book on Welles, and then I was going to start a book on John Ford with Mike Wilmington.
Right.
I figured Ford was such a big subject, I needed a collaborator, and Mike was a very brilliant guy and a good actor, and he taught me a lot about acting, and so we were working on this book on Ford, and then I went to Hollywood to interview John Ford in 1970, which was quite a thing to get an interview with him because he was very hard to interview.
Yes.
He didn't like to give interviews.
Not only did he not suffer fools, he didn't suffer anybody who wasn't a fool as well.
He was tough to really. It's funny because I have the tape of the interview and I put it online recently.
Yep.
You can Google it.
Yep.
It's an unedited tape. It's kind of embarrassing in a way because I was kind of ghost and flustered to interview this great man who was so difficult. He really gave me a hard time. I mean, he was nice and he was funny because he could be warm and nice in one moment, the next moment say something really cutting, and then he would pretend like he didn't remember films. I tried to talk about Fort Apache, which was a film that meant a lot to me then, and he claimed he didn't remember it, and things like this, and I didn't know what was going on. I mean, he was pulling my leg, which he did with interviewers all the time.
But anyway, you're saying...
he retired in the middle of the interview. Toward the end of the interview, he actually announced his retirement. I came on the last day of his career,
right?
Just by chance, by awful chance. During the interview, he kept asking his secretary in a very anxious voice, has the gentleman from Italy called? Have you gotten a letter from this gentleman? Has he called us? I didn't know what he was talking about, but he seemed very preoccupied, and the last thing he wanted to do was talk to some young guy about his old movies.
Right.
And then he said, I'm just a hard-nosed, hard-working, and then there was a long pause. He said, ex-director, and I'm trying to retire gracefully. And then I found, looking at his papers many years later, I looked up that week, and what he was doing was waiting for word from Italy. a Western that Woody Strode, his actor friend, was trying to promote Woody Strode to become a star in Italian Westerns. And so he was trying to get Ford to do an Italian Western, and there was a producer who was interested, and Ford was waiting for the word and didn't come. So he knew that was when he realized this is the end of my career.
When they did,
so here I am.
Yeah. Let's just pause for a second, though, Joe, and appreciate the irony of the fact that Ford, in the waning days of his life or his career anyway, was considering making a spaghetti western when the spaghetti western was invented because of American westerns, and that they were making these much cheaper westerns shot with Spanish actors, and they would bring over some character actors from the States whose careers were kind of on the decline, and in some cases actually saw a new chapter in their or somebody
like Clint Eastwood who became a star in it.
Oh well, of course, I'm even thinking even not so big a case, but Lee Van Cleef all of a sudden had a new career, and Woody Strode's career continued, and then John Ford is trying to make it, and he can't even pull that off. But I just so much to appreciate. At that same meeting when you were interviewing Ford, didn't you pull out at the end something that you commemorated to him, some work of yours?
Well, I had published a book in Madison called Persistence of Vision,
right,
which is a collection of criticism by me and other people at the Wisconsin Film Society, and we had some things in there about Ford and Welles, and it was dedicated to Ford. And I gave him a copy of the book, and he lifted his eyeglasses up because he couldn't see very well.
He's blind,
at the thing. He said, "Oh, that's sweet," which I thought was really interesting because actually, as a future biographer, I wasn't planning to do a biography in 1970, but within a year, I began thinking there needs to be a biography of him because there's never hadn't been one at that point. But it was an invaluable experience to be with him for an hour of his life, even though he didn't say much. Sometimes, actually, some of the things he said were very interesting, but some were ridiculous. But just to observe him, his body language and his personality, and he seemed very vulnerable to me, which was surprising. Here I'm a young guy, and he's been in the business for 50 years, and he should have been more secure, but he seemed very insecure, and it was partly because he'd been kicked around for 5 years and hadn't been allowed to make a film, and it was forgotten. It was a terrible thing, and that's what started Welles on doing The Other Side of the Wind. Was Peter Bogdanovich was telling him about how terrible it is that Ford and Hawks are having trouble making films, and he told Welles the details, and Welles said he was so upset he couldn't sleep that night. And he went back to his hotel, and he started thinking, I better make a film about this. And that was the impetus. Welles had been planning to make a similar film some years before called The Sacred Beast, which was going to be about a Hemingway-esque figure who was following bullfights. And it was going to be a deconstruction of macho sensibilities, which is what The Other Side of the Wind is.
Right.
But it was going to be set in the world of bullfighting, but it was going to be about filmmaking as well. But then he became galvanized again to, okay, let's focus it on a great old director from the Hollywood past who's having trouble making a film or finishing a film. And he's coming back to Hollywood to try to, capitalize on the youth movement, and it doesn't work. And he's trying to get money for his film. And, so this all came together. And it was kind of interesting. It all ties in because right at that time I met Bogdanovich, and I went to Larry Edmunds' bookshop, and I knew that, Peter had done this wonderful interview book with Ford in 1968, which was so rare that somebody had all this access to Ford, and I wanted to talk to Peter about Ford and Welles, and I admired his film Targets, which I had seen in 1968 when I was at the Democratic Convention protesting. I took time out to see Targets. So I got his phone number and called him, and he said, come on over to the house. He was living in a very modest house in Van Nuys. And he very nicely talked to me for 3 hours, answered all my questions about Ford and Welles, because a lot of what they were doing was mysterious at the time to me. And it turned out that Welles had asked Peter to round up some cineast characters to be in this film.
Oh, okay.
And so he recommended to Welles, there's this guy I met, and Peter told me at the premiere of the film at Telluride, he said, Welles said, I had been at a screening of Fellini's Satyricon, so I scribbled notes on my wrist. I ran out of paper, and I was writing notes notes with my pen. And I still do this when I'm going to school or whatever. I'll jot down a few words, or if I think of something. It's just a funny habit. Peter thought this was hilarious, and he told Welles, he said, I met this funny guy who's a film buff, and he writes on his hand. And Welles thought that was hysterically funny, so he said, well, put him in the film, you know. So, what was this, 2 or 3 days later, I wound up being in an Orson Welles film.
Yeah. Wow. So there you were, and there's John Huston and Rich Little, right?
Yeah, everybody else in the world, too, yeah.
And all these make a stock of these, almost like a John Ford stock characters, right? I mean, he had his stable of actors that he used, and you kind of created that around. They weren't all actors, but you created this, like, exists on these huge characters like Orson Welles, and they have all these people that are that are in that gravitational orbit, you know, around somebody like that, you know.
Yeah, it was kind of there was a lot of Ford in the Hannaford character.
Yeah, there
Hannaford is a composite figure,
right,
composed mostly of Hemingway, but also, as Welles told me, he's partly Ford, he's partly Hawks, Huston,
and Welles.
And Welles, yeah, there are elements of Welles' own story, but he's unlike Welles in that he's this macho, blowhard,
right,
skirt-chasing guy, which Welles was not that kind of a man, you know.
Yeah.
So he was really kind of trying to attack the Hemingway ethos of, he admired him as an artist, but as a man he thought he was kind of a sham. And a lot has been written about Hemingway. There was a very good biography recently by a woman, the first time a woman has written a biography of Hemingway, and it gets a lot of fresh insights into his sexuality and his vulnerability. And that's one reason I've always liked his work. He's my favorite writer because, contrary to his macho image, he writes a lot about male fragility and male insecurity and you know, all these issues surrounding masculinity, which is what Welles is delving into in the film. This is years before other people were even aware of this. And so he combined all these things into this film that he started shooting that weekend. By the way, the day I met Ford, later that day I went to Jean Renoir's house and I met him.
Renoir? The same day?
So I met...
At the same day you met, the same day you talked to Ford.
Yeah, I went to see Ford, then I went over to Renoir's house and met him. He was wonderful by comparison to Ford. He was such a nice, charming guy to talk to. So in my first week in Hollywood, I met my 3 favorite directors, and I also met Peter Bogdanovich, who I admired a lot. And I left a request with Hitchcock for an interview, and he actually called my hotel and said, come on over, and they didn't give me the message. So I missed seeing Hitchcock. I could have met him in 1 week. So the funny thing about that week is, I kind of thought all weeks in Hollywood would be like this. It was really an amazing week, of course. But, and then I realized later this was the pinnacle of my Hollywood life. It's been downhill ever since.
Well, they can't take that week away from you, Joe.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, but you know, it was kind of a one-of-a-kind thing too. But you know, I only had 1 hour with Ford, and I got to know Renoir better years later. I met him again at a screening of The Story of Adele H., and I would go see him every Saturday with Todd McCarthy, who's now the Hollywood Reporter, film critic, and Todd and I would show him 16mm prints of new and old films because he couldn't get out much because he was in a wheelchair.
Oh, okay.
And so we would watch films, or he would show some of his films to us, and we'd sit and talk to him. And it was a wonderful thing that for the last 3 years of his life we did that. We got to know him quite well.
That's fantastic. I love his introductions to his films that they show, you know, a Criterion has them before he introduces each one. They're so beautiful. I love his introductions.
Those are great. Yeah, he did those for French television, and several of the films have those filmed interviews that are filmed introductions that are great. So I came at a great time where all these people were around to interview, and a lot of them felt neglected. Hawks also was very accessible to me, and I did an interview book with him, Hawks on Hawks, and they were flattered that some young guy, and not just me, but Peter and other people too, knew their work, and I mean, it was a thrill because most people in Hollywood didn't know who they were anymore, and so we'd ask them real specific questions about their films, and they got to talk about them, and then I would publish these things in film magazines or in books, so I was doing them a favor as well.
Right.
And then I was getting to learn about film history. I went to see Hawks a lot, partly because I was trying to be a screenwriter, and he was a master of storytelling. And even though he didn't and write his own scripts. He always worked with the writers, so he really could tell me a lot about how to do screenplays and everything else. And so I was learning. This was kind of my film school. That and
Sure.
Variety. I was a film critic and reporter for Variety, so I got to go on sets of films. And I met all kinds of contemporary filmmakers, and from not only American but foreign filmmakers who came to Hollywood. And I could, in those days, you can't do that as much anymore because the industry has gotten very corporate. But back then, you could call up and say, "Can I come on the set tomorrow of such and such a film?" And they'd say, "Sure, come on over," and you can interview the director and the stars and whatever, cameraman. And so I got to see a lot of films being shot, which was very important to me because when I was in Wisconsin, I had only a very vague idea of how films were made. And when you're a film historian, it really helps to know the nuts and bolts of filmmaking. And so I've had sort of four careers. I'm a journalist, I was a screenwriter, I'm a historian and biographer, and I'm a teacher now. And they all kind of tie in with each other, but it's unusual for people to do all those things. But screenwriting and that helped me a lot to understand filmmaking and also how Hollywood worked. I couldn't have written these biographies without being in the trenches and understanding the business, which I also got from Variety. And then I could see all these people. I spent 3 days watching Hitchcock shoot Family Plot, for example, his last film, which was a real thrill to watch Hitchcock at work. And so I was able to learn by all this. But I'd say Welles was more my film school. I spent 5+ years acting on the other side of the wind, and he put me in there because he wanted people to play sort of funny versions of themselves, slightly exaggerated, satirical versions of themselves, and he wanted what he called personages as much as actors. He had a lot of great actors in the film, but he had people playing themselves or versions of themselves, and so he surrounded Huston's character with all these Hollywood characters, media people and film people, and so I became one of them. He thought I was funny, and he kept bringing me back for more and more. And in 1971, we did a lot of shooting in L.A., and by then he had written a complete script. And one of the sort of the myths of this film is it's kind of improvised, but he had talked about improvising the whole film, but he didn't actually wind up doing that, except in my case to some extent, because the way we would work, he would talk to me for like an hour before the shoot every day, and he would say, "What would you ask Hannaford?" And I play a young critic who follows Huston's character around, asking him sort of silly or probing film buff questions that get him irritated. And so I would say, "How about if I ask him this and this and this?" Then Welles would reject some ideas and take some ideas, and then he would build on them. And so we were kind of writing these questions together, and then he would type them out, and he would do, embellish upon them, usually to make them a little more pretentious sounding, because he was making fun of academic or intellectual critics.
Right.
And then he would type it up, and I'd have to read it exactly and, memorize it and hit the marks exactly. And he didn't allow me to improvise any gestures or words at all once we had agreed on it, but I did have the input into it. Some of the questions I ask in the film are things I thought of, like asking, "Is the camera a phallus?" which a lot of people think is funny. I actually stole that from Peter Fonda. Said that about Roger Vadim in an interview in Esquire.
Oh, really?
He said, "His camera is a phallus, man." So I said that to Welles, but I picked up
that was
on
his brother-in-law.
Sexual obsessions of
it's a
this
weird
film.
It's a weird question to ask your brother-in-law.
Well, yeah, I mean, and
Peter asking Roger.
With Rex Reed, he was talking about this film that they were going to do. Was an Edgar Allan Poe film, Spirits of the Dead, that Vadim contributed to, and he was married to Jane Fonda, and Peter Fonda wanted to be her lover in this film and to have an incestuous thing going. And he said, "Wow, wouldn't that be cool, man?" I mean, Peter Fonda was pretty out there at the time.
Clearly,
you can find this interview.
Clearly, yeah.
So anyway, but I thought in this film the character is a super phallic character, and the film is sort of about the death of phallocracy, to use a fancy word.
That's a word?
Huh?
That's a real word?
It's a real word. I checked.
Okay.
Actually, even at the end of the film, there's a giant phallus that topples over in the film within the film. I think it's hysterically funny, but nobody ever laughs when we see that scene. But I think it's like a 6-foot phallus, and it falls over as Zoya Kodar is walking around naked. And I mentioned that to Frank Marshall, who was one of the producers, and he said, "Oh, I was inside that phallus. He was the guy who made it topple over.
Oh,
he
wow.
was standing inside, and he pushed it over, and he fell over. That was how they did that." So I had that line in there, and then Welles thought that was hysterically funny, and so we had that in. And I also asked him about how his father's suicide affected his film work, and I was thinking of Hemingway's father killing himself and how that affected Hemingway. And I didn't realize that Welles thought his father had committed suicide, even though his death certificate indicates he died of heart and liver disease in a hotel room in Chicago. But Welles thought he had killed himself and that he was responsible for it because he had cut his father off. He was an alcoholic, and he was practicing what we call tough love, I won't see you again until you stop drinking, and then his father dies, miserable death in this hotel room. And Welles said, I always felt guilty about that, and I've never forgiven myself. He said, that's why I don't believe in psychoanalysis, because he said, I don't think you should forgive yourself, you should live with it. And I think that's the root of all the betrayals in all his films. They're all about male betrayal. Two men love each other, and one betrays the other and destroys the other or destroys himself. And there are variations on this, but all the Welles films are about that, really. And The Other Side of the Wind is about that. So I think Welles was excited by that question.
Chimes of Midnight comes to mind.
Chimes of Midnight is the perfect example of Falstaff and Prince Hal love each other like a father and son, and then he betrays the old man, and the old man dies of a broken heart.
Right.
When Hal becomes the king, he doesn't want to be associated anymore with this drunken old guy, and that's very close to Wells's heart. And at the end of the film, at the end of Other Side of the Wind, late in the film, there's a scene Welles wrote in 1974, and I found it in my script recently, where I materialized from behind a cactus, and I'm trying to be helpful to Hannaford and suggest that I could ask Bogdanovich's character for money to help him, which is a real sore point in the film. It's the height of presumption for this young guy to do this. And then Paul Stewart's character says, "Who let this yo-yo in here?" And then Hannaford says to me, "We don't ask our chums for money," and then he looks at me and he says, "Always remember that your heart is God's little garden," which is a line Welles used to use. I don't know why. It was just one of his funny lines that he would say, "Always remember your heart is God's little garden." Originally, Houston was supposed to pinch me on the cheek when he said that, but when we filmed it, I was really looking forward. That was my big scene with Houston. But when we filmed it, he was not there. And I asked one of the crew, I said, "Where's Houston?" And he said, "Oh, he's off making some little film somewhere." Turned out he was doing the Man Who Would Be King.
Oh, The Man Who Would Be King.
In Morocco, which is his greatest film, and it's big epic in a way.
You think more than The Treasure of Sierra Madre?
Huh?
More than Treasure of Sierra Madre?
Well, I think those are very similar films in their style and themes, but
That's true.
I think The Man Who Would Be King is just a great, perfect film, but the other one is great, too. So anyway, we had to double Houston. There was double Houston.
Yeah.
But the way it's edited by Bob Murawski, who did a fantastic job of editing all the footage, you couldn't tell that Houston and I are not there together. It's edited so it looks like we're having an intimate conversation. But, the funny thing was when I saw the film for the first time all put together in January 2018, I was, I'm a consultant on the film with Jonathan Rosenbaum, and they brought me down to look at it and make comments, and I offered some suggestions, some of which they took and some they didn't. But I had totally forgotten that scene. I had no memory of that. And I have a good memory, but I had forgotten doing that.
Clearly.
And, then I went home and I looked at my script, and there I found the folded pages of this inserted scene, and it's a pretty good little scene. But it plays off that theme of, actually what happens with the suicide theme is really a major theme in the film later when Hannaford reveals to, he's talking to Peter's character about how his own father killed himself, hanged himself from a chandelier at the Hollywood Hotel. and it's a very devastating scene, and Peter's character knows about it, and because he's an expert on Hannaford, and it's clearly blighted Hannaford's whole life. And so Welles picked up on that theme, and I don't know if he would have done that if I hadn't brought it up originally. One thing I'm a little disappointed by in the film, originally the idea was when I asked Hannaford that line in the car, I got thrown out of his car because I offended him with that question, which I thought was kind of cool. And there is a scene of me being thrown out of the car, and then the camera pulls away. But for whatever reason, Welles shot a scene later of Gregory Sierra pulling up on a motorcycle. He's supposed to be like John Milius, and he says, "You guys are overloaded. You're going to have to lose somebody in the car," and they tell me to get out of the car.
Yeah. Oh, you're there. That's right. It's you.
Is not as interesting,
Yeah, that's right. That's you.
It would have been funnier if I got thrown out for offending the guy.
You got a producer credit on it ultimately?
No, I was trying to produce the film back in the 90s. Gary Graber, the cameraman, who's really the hero of the whole thing, he made the whole film possible. He kept trying for decades to get this film finished. And in the 90s, I thought, I really got to get this out. So I called Gary and I said, let's join forces and let's try to get the money to finish this film. And we were going to get Peter to edit the film and finish it, which he was involved finally in doing that. And Gary had put together a kind of a very, very rough cut, which was sort of misleading because it wasn't the whole film. It was just certain scenes, but it was about 95 minutes long, and we showed it to people, and they couldn't really follow it very well.
Right.
And it was sort of a mess. There were some scenes that were very well edited by Welles, and there's some things that Gary just threw in there. And it kind of had the unfortunate effect of looking like a very messy feature film instead of just scenes. I said, let's go back and cut it down to like an hour and just have the 40 minutes Welles edited with maybe 20 minutes of other stuff. And Gary didn't want to do that, but we showed it to everybody. Spielberg, Lucas, Clint Eastwood, Oliver Stone, all these people passed on it. And the only place that was interested was Showtime. And I had this unusual idea. Back in the 90s, this was very unusual. Go to a cable company and finish the film if the studios don't want it, and powerful producers and directors don't want to help us, screw these people. Let's. So there was a guy at Showtime, Matthew Duda, who was an executive who wanted to do it, but they made a $3 million offer. I made up this budget of $3 million to pay for the rights and post production, and then Peter and Oya Kodar fired me as soon as we made that deal because they felt they didn't need me. And I just walked away from it. I thought it was very unfair, but I just figured the film has had so much trouble, I'm not going to make any more trouble. I just walked away. And then the deal collapsed right after that.
The Showtime deal.
Welles' daughter, Beatrice, started causing trouble.
Okay.
I kind of think if they hadn't fired me, the film might have been out around 2004, because I would have gotten it done. But all those years after that, Showtime kept trying to make a deal, but it was very difficult to make a deal with the rights holders. A very, very long story. Josh Karp wrote an interesting book about that.
Yeah, he's been on here.
And I wrote a lot about that in my book, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles. This very long, bizarre story of trying to finish this film. And finally, new people came in. Filipion Rimza, who's a young Polish-born filmmaker, and Frank Marshall, who had been with the film from the beginning, almost from the beginning. He was a young production assistant, production manager in 1971 when I met him. And so they got together with Peter, and they managed to pull it off. And Philip negotiated for 9 years with Oya Kodar. She was very difficult to negotiate with, and he finally got the rights from her and the Iranian investor's family. And I'm glad, frankly, that I was fired, because I wouldn't have wanted to spend 9 years of my life suffering like that. And then Frank has a lot of clout in Hollywood, and he was able to get all kinds of things done, and he got Netflix involved, and Netflix, to their great credit, believed in the film. Ian Brick and Ted Sarandos, the executives of Netflix, really are visionaries, because they understood that it's important to get this Orson Welles film finished. And they weren't totally sure there was enough there to make a complete film, because until they went into the vault in Paris and inventoried all the film, nobody was quite sure, did all the film exist and what shape it was in. I mean, but it all turned out to be there. Some of the original sound was lost, but they had dupes of some of the soundtracks. But there's a good documentary called The Final Cut for Orson, 40 Years in the Making, which is on Showtime, that shows the amazing post-production. So Netflix put up $6 million and had the faith in this film, which I think they're like the George Schaefer's of 2018. George Schaefer was the executive who hired Welles on Kane, and that's the only time he ever had an executive like that in his career who just believed in him and let him pretty much make the film he wanted. And so these guys come along, and I told them that, and they were happy to hear that, because that's what we wanted all those years, was people with some money who would have faith in Welles. Sure, it's an important film. Let's finish it. Why not? Not everybody's going to like it. Not everybody did like it, but generally it got a lot of acclaim and a lot of high rankings in critics' polls. And on the Sight and Sound list of international critics, I think it came in number 13 or 14 for the year. And
I saw it at the New York Film Festival at Alice Tully Hall, and the audience was howling. I mean, they were so enthusiastic. This audience I sat with, they wanted to. I mean, I know this doesn't sound like a real compliment, but they wanted to love the film, and then they really did love the film. But it's like this. They went in with this appetite. They went in with this, and they were very primed, and they went in with this tremendous appetite of the anticipation of all the years and all the close calls, and it was worth the wait. Personally,
I didn't know you were at that screening. I was there too. I went there. It was very exciting.
Yeah.
And before that was the Telluride American premiere. The first screening was shortly before that in Venice. I wasn't there, but such excitement among film buffs, both in Telluride and New York, because they'd been waiting for decades, people like us, wanting to see this film and wondering, it's kind of like a dream come true. A lot of people thought we'd never get to see this film. I was beginning to wonder, would we ever see this? And here it comes together, and I think Bob Murawski did just an amazing job of making it all work beautifully. He had 96 hours of footage, and the editing is fantastic. He built it around Welles's scenes that Welles had edited and established the style, and he made it play in the same style, and the sound work was wonderful. It took a lot of work to get the sound right, and a very complex sound design as in all Welles films, and then the music by Michel Legrand. And it looks so great. The color looks fabulous. Gary Graver's cinematography is so beautiful, but the work print that we showed for years looked very battered and faded, and so to finally see it the way it's supposed to look, even Welles and Gary had never seen all the footage, because unlike on most films, they didn't print everything. They would just put it away, and then so they never saw this stuff. And so here we are watching this film at Alice Tully Hall. It was quite an experience. And Martin Scorsese, you remember, came out, and he had just seen it for the first time a couple days before, and he gave a wonderful appreciation of it, and what a surprise it was. A lot of people said that it was a surprising film for Welles, because Welles never made the same kind of film twice.
Right.
And in a way, that was part of his problem, because people didn't quite know how to pigeonhole him like they did other, even great directors like Ford and Hawks.
Hitchcock.
You kind of knew what you were going to get.
Yeah,
with
Hitchcock.
variations. But with Welles or Kubrick, I compare him to Kubrick. Each film they made was completely different and unexpected from what they'd done before, and so people would come in and see 2001 and say, "What the heck is this?" They had just seen Dr. Strangelove, and then it took a few years to catch up to 2001.
Right.
And then they'd finally say, "Oh, that's a great film." That's often what happens with Welles. So I think the reputation of Other Side of the Wind will just keep growing over time. And some critics said, and this was intelligent, I think, that there's so much going on in this film. It's so complex and layered that it's going to take a while for us to fully understand everything he's doing.
Right.
I mean, I didn't have trouble understanding. Some people thought, I don't get it. But, I mean, I'm close to it, but it is a dense, complex, difficult film in some ways, and it does take time for people to get acclimated to a new kind of storytelling. And Scorsese said Welles was reinventing the language of cinema, which I thought was a wonderful thing to say. And Welles did that throughout his career, and he's doing it again in a new way. It's a very fresh film. It's kind of a mind-blowing thing if you think if this had come out in 73, let's say, it would have been so far ahead of its time. Even now it's ahead of its time in terms of the style and themes. It kind of stunned people in some ways, Back then, I think it would have totally blown their minds. But so it comes at a good time. I think it's a good time for it to come out.
I think so too. Let's just remind people again of your newest book, which is, I guess, it is approaching. Like this spring, it'll be approaching. It's 1 year that it's been out, but it's called "How Did Lubitsch Do It?" and it's written by Joseph McBride and published by Columbia University Press.
Yep.
And it's available wherever books are sold, and it is one of many of your books. This ended up the reverse of how I intended it, but it couldn't have gone any better. What I would love to do when it makes sense, I am so fascinated because I just came off of reading the John Ford book, and even though we did talk about him somewhat in this conversation, first of all, I feel like after reading that book, all 750 plus pages, that I really felt like this guy was alive. I mean, I come after reading it, and I miss him. I miss him.
Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, he came to life, and so I want to talk about it because he's so complicated a guy. So like so many of these other guys that we're talking about. So,
but subject and hard, enigmatic character.
Yeah.
That's why it took me a long time to do that book, and I'm very happy with it.
And you really,
but he's not an easy man to understand, but he's endlessly fascinating, as are his films.
No, but I want to explore it with you, and it doesn't have to be 2 hours. But I want to come back, and I think this is a great place to end this particular conversation. But I do want to come back and do something special on John Ford, and maybe there's an occasion. Maybe there's an anniversary or something coming up.
Well, actually, this is his 125th birthday being celebrated this month.
It is?
He was born February 1st, 1894, and in the state of Maine, where he's from, they've been celebrating with special events they've been having in Portland, Maine, which is the town where he grew up, and other places they've been showing his films and having talks and conferences. So this is his 125th year, so that's a good excuse.
Okay, so that doesn't give us a whole lot of time, but let's maybe in the next week or two we should.
Well, it'll be his 125th year for a whole year.
That's true.
I figure you should celebrate your birthday for a whole year.
I agree, especially if it's your 125th. If only he had made it this long. Anyway, so yeah, let's do this. I would love to have another because I have so many thoughts on him, and it was such a gratifying read as I was racing towards the ending, but I was just. At the one time, I couldn't wait to finish it. On the other hand, I was dreading finishing it. You know how that goes. Well, thank you for this.
It's a sad ending in some ways because he was rejected, but on the other hand, he made such fabulous films in the later part of his work, and I think they were underappreciated, so I was trying to do justice to them, so I'm very happy with the last part of that.
Yeah, no, and I do want to talk about it. I have not seen Seven Women. I have to get a copy of it. It's not so readily available, but I finally caught up with quite a few, including Cheyenne Autumn and a number of others that I
think Seven Women is on the internet now. Somebody told me.
I'll find it. I'm resourceful like that, as you can tell.
Yeah. I think it's on some streaming channel or something. It's a really great film.
I'll find it. Yeah, no, I look forward to it. Well, thank you so much, Joe. Thank you. Really appreciate all your time and so many wonderful...
Well, thank you, Adam. It's been great. Really interesting discussion, and I appreciate all your good questions and all the things you brought up. It's real food for thought.
I didn't get to a fraction of them, but as you have so much to share. I didn't really even anticipate it being quite as plentiful as it is. Just the sheer quantity of stories. But we'll come back together shortly.
Yeah, that's great. Anytime.
Okay, I appreciate it.
I'm really happy. I look forward to our next talk.
Me too.
And talking about Ford is one of my favorite things, so it's been terrific. Thank you. Thanks for your nice comments on my books.
Oh, yeah. Sure, you got it.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And